Notice prosecutors, defense attorneys, as well as law enforcement. What do you notice? That everybody looks the same except for the defendant. Yeah. It's hard to get a fair trial when the only way that they see you is as a criminal or as a felon or as a convict. Notice the fact of the clothes that he's wearing, right? We say innocent until proven guilty, but yet we dress people like they're guilty before they've even had a trial. Welcome, students. Class is in session. We are in Criminal Law 101, and you are listening to Professor Darrell J. Bennett, where I give you an Ivy League law education. I'm Darrell J. Bennett, professor, a Harvard law educated legal scholar, as well as a former attorney and a former federal prisoner. I know what it's like to represent clients and to be represented. I have an entirely different way of how I look at the law and how I work with clients now, helping them to navigate the legal system, helping them to come back after an arrest. And now I'm taking everything I've learned from my own personal lived experience and professional experience so I can teach you as well. You are listening to the voice of Professor Darrell J. Bennett, and this is Criminal Law 101. Today, we are going to watch the preliminary hearing or a bail hearing for NBA Youngboy. Full disclosure, I don't know NBA Youngboy. This is my first time actually ever having laid eyes on him. I've heard of his name before. Didn't even know what he looked like until I saw a little bit of this video. But we're here in Utah so we can watch this. And the goal is for us to learn some of the concepts of the law just by watching him. As with anybody that we profile or we show on this channel, I just want to say, I hope he comes out of it a better person, whatever that outcome is going to be. All right. So let me just say that personally about it. Let's get right to it. I want to call your attention to the fact that this is state court, not federal court. There's three main types of courts. There's local courts, there's state courts, and then there's federal courts. There's also military courts. We won't touch that here. Federal courts, you'll know the difference because they don't have cameras in it. So the fact that we're seeing cameras, you know that we're at a state or local court. This is a state court for Utah. I also want to point out the fact, hold on, because I think it needs to be said. This is the prosecutor's table, prosecution. This is the defense table. Notice he has two attorneys, which is kind of odd, but he's got money. So, hopefully he's using that for his defense. Usually it's just one person to the next of the defendant, but here it's two, one on either side. Notice prosecutors, defense attorneys, as well as law enforcement. What do you notice? That everybody looks the same except for the defendant. Yeah. It's hard to get a fair trial when the only way that they see you is as a criminal or as a felon or as a convict. Notice the fact of the clothes that he's wearing, right? We say innocent until proven guilty, but yet we dress people like they're guilty before they've even had a trial. But I don't even want to touch that. Let's get right into it. All right.
All rise. Court for the First Judicial District of the State of Utah and for the County of Cache is now in session. The Honorable Judge Spencer D. Walk is presiding. You may be seated.
All right, good morning. Let's call the case of State of Utah versus Kentrell Deshaun Galden, case 241100468. Counsel, please state your names for the record.
Aaron Jossie for the state.
Everybody's on the same page. Counsel and attorney is the same thing. It's just the words that's used in the legal proceedings. First, the prosecutor said his name for the record. Now,
and Zach Finland on behalf of Mr. Galden.
Yeah. So,
all right, we're here today for a preliminary hearing and a bail hearing.
Mr. Galden is who you probably know as NBA Youngboy. Just make sure everybody's clear on that.
I've had the opportunity to meet with the attorneys in chambers, and it does appear that there has been some type of an arrangement reached between the parties. Mr. Findling, would you like to go ahead and state that for the record, please?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor,
Let me just say this really quickly so everybody knows we're watching. This is not the trial. Much of what happens in any person's case happens pre-trial. You know, that cousin you might have, or the uncle, or the person you know tangentially through the neighborhood, and you're like, how have you been dealing with this case for years? And hasn't it gone to trial yet? It's probably because they've been caught up in a number of motions. Sometimes people do motions on the defense side because it helps them to kind of kick the can further down the road. They're hoping maybe for leniency from the prosecutor, hoping that charges get dropped. They're hoping that maybe something happens in the world that makes people feel a little better toward them, and a jury will be picked and it will be nicer for them or whatever. But more times than not, everything that you're seeing, 90% of what you're seeing happens in the pre-trial phase, because most people never go to trial. They just don't go to trial because it's just, it's not good if you go to trial and you lose. So this is a
counsel
pre-trial
for
hearing.
the state and myself have been in negotiation really since yesterday, but throughout this morning. And I've explained those negotiations to Mr. Golden. We are going to waive a preliminary hearing in this matter. In exchange for that, a bond will be set at $100,000. Mr. Golden will be able to use a commercial company to make that bond. That will be an aggregate bond covering everything in total, as contained in the charging instrument.
All right.
Hold on, let's make sure that everybody's clear. The charging instrument, let me start with that at the end, right? The charging instrument is the document that is explaining what the charges are at this moment. What his attorney is telling the court is that they have reached an agreement with the prosecutor, right? That's why you hire high-priced attorneys, because they get with their person who probably they went to law school with, maybe was their buddy, maybe was their friend, just happens to sit on the other table, and say, look, let's reach a deal. So here the deal is not for the overall charges that are to come down the line, and this is just for him to get bail. And the deal is that the estate will ask for $100,000 bond, and that Mr. Golden's team will be able to raise that through using one of his commercial, one of his properties. Now, you should know this, two things that I want to say here, then we'll move on. The first thing is that because it's bondable, that means he does not have to pay the entire $100,000. I'll hearken you to what's going on with former President Trump, and how he needed to come up with $575 million, and people joked about that. He never had to come up with all of that. He just had to come up with a bond that and some company would come up with the rest, right? And I know that was lowered in his case, but I'm just giving. And either being held in jail or the threat of being held in jail. So there's third parties. Let's understand this, that are not police officers, right? They're not the judges, they're not the probation officers, they're not the arresting officers, all of the folks that we know get paid from people getting arrested. But then there's a whole other group that benefits off of all of this, and there are bail bondsmen. So they profit when there are arrests and when there are crimes that are sort of happening in the ether that people are being charged with, either formally or informally with, because this is how they make their money. So when you hear folks talk about getting rid of bond or bail reform, it's not that they're saying every
Mr. Keller, does that accurately represent the agreement that's been reached between the state and Mr. Galden?
Yes, it does, Your Honor.
All right. Mr. Galden, have you had enough time to speak to your attorneys about this decision to waive your right to your preliminary hearing?
Yes.
All right. Do you understand that the standard at a preliminary hearing is a much lower burden of proof that the government would have to meet than at trial? So instead of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, it's a lower burden of proof, which is there a reasonable belief that a crime was committed by you? And the court has to view all the evidence that it would receive in a light most favorable to the government, to the prosecution. Understanding that legal standard and having had discussions with your attorneys, do you hereby waive your right to your preliminary hearing?
Yes.
All right.
Let me tell you what's happening here. So he has a right to a preliminary hearing. He's waiving that right because they have, through his attorneys, reached an agreement with the prosecution. Now, what the judge was explaining is that the standard that you may have thought the standard was is not the standard, meaning everybody talks about beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond a reasonable doubt is one of the standards that are used in courtrooms. That is a standard for guilt or innocence. That is not the standard here for the implementation of bail or the dispensation of bail. Here, the standard is different. The standard is it more likely than not, essentially, that the crimes committed did happen by this person or could have happened by this person, and they're looking at it in the light most favorable to the prosecution. So he's explaining all this to Mr. Golden, who I assume was already explained, told this by his attorneys.
The court finds that Mr. Galden has knowingly and voluntarily waived his right to his preliminary hearing. He will be bound over for trial on all the charges set forth in the information, the charging document in this case. Bail will be set through stipulation of the parties at $100,000. That will be bondable. And in talking to the attorney,
Bondable means that he can use a third party company in order to raise some of the money or put up most of the money. That's what it means by being bondable. He does not himself need $100,000 to bring to the court.
attorneys, it sounds like they would like to set this out for an arraignment at a later point in time. Mr. Finley, would you like to go ahead and articulate anything specific related to that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Follow this. We're moving from what is now the bail hearing to they're explaining the arraignment. I'm going to tell you about the arraignment in a second, but just watch what he says.
Discussed in chambers, and I explained to Mr. Golden, even if it's set up for arraignment, say in 60 days, the court has made it clear through discussion with counsel, if there is a resolution well before then, we're welcome to come back before Your Honor at any point in the future.
Okay, very good. So we'll set Mr. Golden's arraignment out in about 60 days. That arraignment would take place through WebEx. We'll have Mr. Golden brought here to the...
What's happening here? He's talking about the arraignment. What is the arraignment? The arraignment is where the judge presents to the defendant the formal charges. So you might be asking, well, wait a minute, hasn't he been charged now? Isn't that why he's in court? Not formally. He's not been formally charged. The formal charging happens at the arraignment. So that means a number of things can happen. This is part of why people push the can. See, this I want to teach you. This is why people sometimes push the can down the road, or they'll do different motions in the pretrial phase, at least before the arraignment. Those charges can be dismissed, meaning the informal charges that were articulated against him at the time of an arrest. That doesn't mean it's formal yet. There hasn't been an arraignment. So there's hopes that the charges can be dropped, the charges could be lessened, the charges could be, in some cases, what's the word I want to use? Consolidated. So let's say, the person's charged with 5 or 6 different things that are, similar. They hope that maybe there can an agreement be reached where it can be consolidated. So there's a lot of things that are happening. One day I'll talk all about how prosecutors, go about charging and the decisions that go in place there. But let's just focus on here. I want you to get what's happening. He's been given the 100,000 or the okay that the bail be set at $100,000. Now it's up to him to raise the money and work with whatever bail company to get out. And next on the calendar, 60 days from now, when the formal arraignment would happen. So you can imagine his attorneys will be doing a lot of work with the prosecution to get those charges down to as minimal as possible. And, best case scenario is that they all dropped. But, that almost never happens.
Courthouse. And then if Mr. Finley would like to appear remotely for that hearing, he may do so. Also, if the attorneys reach some sort of resolution prior to those 60 days expiring, then just reach out to Angie and we'll get that on my calendar in a timely fashion. Angie, a date about 60 days out for that arraignment on a Monday morning, probably. July 1st, at what time? 9? Okay, so that would be July 1st at 9 a.m. or 1:30 p.m. Mountain Time, whatever you'd prefer.
Either one.
Okay, let's do 9 a.m. Does that work for the state?
It does, yes.
You want to be
Your
9 a.m.
arraignment will be July 1st, 9 a.m. You'll be brought over from the Cache County Jail, assuming that you're still incarcerated. If not, you'd be able to appear remotely for that hearing as well, or appear in person, whatever your preference would be. Is there anything else that needs to be stated on the record here today, counsel?
On behalf of Mr. Dalton.
I just want to say this because a lot of times legal jargon makes its way into the world, common, like colloquial parlance, and we don't know what we're saying. When he says on the record, what he's saying is there anything else you want to say that the transcriptionist is typing so that for all time, that whoever reads the record of this case, it's on the record, right? Whenever you see the judge or the lawyers have a sidebar conversation and they're standing up in front of the judge and you don't hear what's going on, that's what's considered off the record. Because obviously the transcription isn't here and to be able to type it. So he's asking the attorney now, is there anything else you want to put on record? Sometimes attorneys want to defense, I'm talking about, wants to put things on record just so that way they could appeal later, right? They want to have things on the record so that way they know even if this judge is going to shoot it down, even if this judge is going to say no to a motion or something that they may have gone up for, they want it on the record so that later on a higher court could look at it and say, was this permissible? Was this not permissible? So it's very important to know what you want on the record versus what you don't.
Further from the state.
All right, with that,
I guess we're going to see what happens from here. Now, of course, the attorneys confer with one another, and it's really all to the races for him. What I mean is now it's a question of, I mean, him getting bail or raising the money, that's the least of his concern. At this point, his attorneys are thinking, A, how do you get the most of the charges dropped and the rest of the ones either lessened or some sort of deal that's reached? So we're going to follow this along. We'll follow what happens at the arraignment and 60 days later, and we'll find out what happens from there. I already shared with you, most defendants plead out before the trial. He doesn't have to plead by the arraignment. The arraignment is still when he'll have the formal charges that are listed. So let me just say this for all of my internet. I got a lot of internet lawyers out there, and I watch some of these videos, and people are like, I know what he's charged with. No, you don't. You know what the police at the time of arrest have put on a worksheet, but there has not been any formal charges that have been handed down yet. There hasn't been an arraignment. So I want to be clear on that. After the arraignment, then comes the scheduling of some level of plea allocution, which is where he will have to say, how do you say? Are you guilty or are you not guilty? And that's where things really start to play from there. So I hope you learned something today. Crim Law 101 with yours truly, Professor Darrell J. Bennett. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, y'all. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more. To follow my work, go to www.darrellbennett.com, spelled just like my name. Reach out to me directly. contact@darrellbennett.com, spelled just like my name, or text 888-571-3989.
I just hit my rhythm, boy.